So my name is Michael Cronin. I'm director of the Trinity Centre for Literary and Cultural Translation, and also co-editor of the New Perspectives in Translating and Interpreting Studies. And this year we're celebrating the 10th year of the existence of the series. And today my guest is Brian Baer, who published a very important volume for us in the series Queer Theory and Translation Studies, Language, Politics, Desire. So Brian is a professor of Russian and Translation Studies in Kent State University. He is also the author of the monograph Russian Translation and the Making of Modern Russian Literature, and he also co-edited the volume with Klaus Kaindl on queering translation, translating the queer. Brian, if I could begin by picking up on something that you kind of mentioned throughout the book, and that where you talk about this, there's a kind of common area of concern for both translation studies and queer theory, which is a kind of a preoccupation with notions of sameness and difference, with the notions of borders and bordering, border effects, and so on. And of course, as you kind of explore the histories of different queer practices in terms of different translators in different languages, one of the questions that one asks, why did it take so long for a volume like yours to come out? Why, if you like, was what would seem like a fairly obvious convergence at some level between what interests translation scholars and what interests queer theorists? It took an awfully long time for it to be made visible. Why do you think there was that sort of delay?
Right. So yeah, over the course of the project, I confronted that question many times because I was surprised and intrigued by all the overlaps, and both at a kind of theoretical level, like the relationship of translation as a kind of abject form of writing in the modern nation state, and of course queer sexuality made abject by I think romantic nationalism and so on. I was quite surprised, and then when I started looking at it, I think it comes out of that the birth of translation studies maybe in the post-war internationalism, which was built on nation states, right? This new international cooperation, but built on that bedrock of independent nation states, which is why Sakai says that the addressee of all translations in the modern world is monolingual. And I think out of that, it was these typical national cultural identities, right? Your language and your national culture. And so if you look at the really beautiful volume, 2-volume set by Theo Hermans, Translating Others, the other was always a linguistic or cultural, understood very narrowly, of course, because we can understand gender and sexuality as part of culture, of course, but it was understood in this very narrow way. And that lasted for quite a long time. And again, more surprising given the very kind of out and proud sexuality of James Holmes, who's often raised up as one of the founders of the field for having named translation studies and provided that mapping of the field very early on. But he himself didn't incorporate it into his theorizing. So he did very interesting kind of queer translations of Latin queer poets, and yet never integrated that into his thing. So yeah, it remains a little bit of a conundrum, but I think it comes out of that very traditional, very narrow understanding of what constitutes a national culture, and then just reinforces this commonality that in national historiography, queer sexuality and translations have typically been either marginalized or left out entirely.
If I could just pick up on one point there, you mentioned this kind of notion of romantic nationalism, and of course one of the things that the Romantics have is this preoccupation with the notion of origin, with the notion of originality, And, translation then is depicted as kind of derivative hack work. It's kind of related to classical imitation. And you talk about this notion of the kind of the reproductive state, the kind of the national reproductive state, and that translation, like non-reproductive relationships, were seen as lesser in the context of this the cult of origin. Do you think we're still in the grip of that suspicion? Do you think that the kind of preoccupation? I mean, you mentioned this question about of monolingualism, and Gramling's work on this kind of reinforces it, but that the translation itself is still an object of suspicion, because somehow it's not original, and it's not reproductive. It's a kind of it has a kind of a sterility about it.
Yes, and in fact, one of the great Russian poets of the early 19th century, who was a Decembrist, and he was exiled for that, and some Kuchelbecker, he lamented in one of his letters that they were translating too much in Russia, and that they needed to do more original writing. And he said, who will translate translators? So this idea that it was a dead end in terms of literary production. And I think that's still there beneath the surface. And even I would comment on Laurie Chamberlain's very influential work on the gender politics. It's not just that translations are women. It's a sterile kind of relationship, because it doesn't give birth to anything else beyond the translation, right? But of course, that's predicated on the fact that we ignore mediated phenomena like translation, like relay translation, which we've completely ignored for so long as doubly mediated, right? And in fact, I would venture to say, if we just consider the fact that most of Russian literature in the 19th century was translated in Europe and most other parts of the world through the English, German, and French translations, in terms of sheer numbers, indirect translation is probably greater than direct translation. And so yes, and then now in this moment of the rise of ethno-nationalism, those tropes are very much present for them simply to invoke. And then of course the whole anti-gender theory in Europe. It's those tropes were never fully deconstructed and problematized, and so they just remain there for people to invoke, and they have great purchase for people still. And I was just reading for another class Anthony Pym's article about Schleiermacher, in which I think he gives a really important counter reading to Venuti's celebration of foreignization as somehow inherently counter-hegemonic. And he notes that in that article, that's where Schleiermacher says you cannot, bilingualism is unnatural. To have two languages is like having two mothers, and then utterly condemns these kind of this German word that's difficult to translate, but that Pym relates to his notion of intermediaries, that something in between these two is untenable. And I go back why translations and translators are in some sense queer vis-a-vis the nation state, is that we do have double allegiances often. We're attracted to these other cultures, often living in them because we're so interested in them for whatever reason, or that we've come from them and resettled somewhere else. So this intense desire to theorize or away the notion of in-betweenness, I think is problematic for us. And I understand Tomoshko's point that yes, it's not a no place, but I think as Catherine Batchelor rethinks that and says, it is a place. It's not a political no place, but it is indeed, if we look at a Venn diagram, there is that place in between, and it has its own properties, etc. And it's vis-a-vis the nation state, it's a queer space. And those people have been often construed as threats to the nation state, whether it's those people who are accused of being spies or something, or having split loyalties and all of that. Yeah.
Do you think that's the way in which certain queer theorists rethink notions of affiliation or relationality could be useful for ways we think about translation? I'm thinking particularly of Barry McCrae, a critic who's written a book called The Company of Strangers, where he basically looks at what's happening in the early 19th century novel, where basically there's this thing about the children that get lost or mistakenly orphaned or adopted or whatever, and then you get this moment of the reconstitution of the biological family, the kind of the reestablishment of genealogical relationships and so on. So he says this is one kind of notion of kinship, and he says the other, and he takes Fagin's Pickpockets and the Invertis, the gay community in Paris in Marcel Proust as people, or the relationship between Bloom and Daedalus in Joyce's Ulysses, as a kind of relationship or the establishment of a community that is not based on a kind of genealogical, kind of reproductive affiliation, but is a sense of assumed kinship of a particular kind. So, I mean, is there? Do you think it's a sense in which one of the things that when we write translation histories and think about translation, that it's a kind of it's the queering of kinship might be a better model for what we do or think about?
Yes, but I think the whole fascination with orphans in much of European literature of the 19th century also is meant to reinforce the nation state, right? As Anderson said, it's an imagined community, and you don't realize you're a part of it until you don't have a biological family, right? And then these people become, in some ways, avatars of the nation, right? These Dickens characters who become, so British in the imagination. And I think that's it, because the key to this whole notion of the nation as an imagined community is that somehow you're able to think that all these other people are connected to you in some kind of kinship, right? Do you imagine that you have a relationship to all these people, although you will know, right, some teeny weeny fraction of all your fellow people? And so I think that's the function of the orphans. And yeah, and that was able to be celebrated in the literature of the time, but translation is not easily incorporated into that.
Yeah, I mean, maybe that's where the title of McCrae's book, The Company of Strangers. I often think that's what is more appropriate of what happens to translation then when it gets disseminated and the way in which it engages with others in particular ways. Brian, I wanted to ask you a question, which is a question that you yourself ask in the book. At one point, you say, what makes a work on translation queer in the sense of being deeply informed by the insights of queer theory? So if I could ask you the question that you ask yourself.
Right. So first of all, I should mention there's a creative tension between queer theory and identity politics. And most recently, queer theorists have challenged gay rights movement for replicating the same exclusions as national cultures often do. So it excludes often people of color, non-middle class people, right? And so you get a gay movement in the United States that's populated, or the face of it is often white middle class people. And so the term was coined homo-nationalism, in the way that this movement has in some ways aped the dynamics of nationalism, which marginalizes those movements. And so some of the historians of the gay rights movement have done really interesting work, like Robert Dean Tobin on German gay rights, and talk about this kind of the original sin of the gay rights movement, which is the congenital argument that homosexuality belongs to a small minority. It's restricted there, and so cannot be a threat to the nation state. And so the nation state can show tolerance to that stable, discrete minority. And yet, at the time in the early 19th, mid-19th century, they were supporting that argument with texts, often ancient Greek texts in translation, that were queer. They weren't, right? They were about a sexuality often related to pederasty, but that was age stratified, that was based on different things that don't jive with the modern egalitarian model of homosexuality. So at the very heart of the movement, there was something very queer, and the queerness came to kind of bite them in the ass toward the end of the century. And so John Addington Symonds says, you know, with all this new interest, social interest in protecting children and this and that, he says, we cannot be Greek anymore. That's when, of course, they discover Whitman and they he's the answer to this, and it's egalitarian and things. So I was curious in that tension between the gay rights movement and how and productively queer it by challenging those the ways in which it aligns or apes the exclusionary mechanisms of the modern nation. And so I was very surprised to find that when the whole book kind of started when I was looking at the work of Edward Carpenter, and I looked at his anthology. So I became fascinated with gay anthologies because we often talk about the gay rights movement as a kind of nation-based, civil rights-based movement, a minority movement, but their anthologies have always been international, so filled with translations. Whereas you don't expect to find, and you don't find translations, for example, in an anthology of African-American writing. So if you look at Henry Louis Gates, like 400, 500 page, there are no translations there. And so I thought, oh, how does this set the gay movement apart? How does it highlight why the central role of translation? And of course, this idea, the kind of ontological function of these anthologies to say that homosexuality exists everywhere and in all times, right? In any case, when I opened up his anthology from the early 20th century, Ioleus, he writes at the beginning kind of offhandedly, I've placed the text in this in a chronological, roughly evolutionary order. And then the first text is an ethnographic piece by Dr. Livingston about African tribes, which comes before the ancient Greeks. So I thought, there's something very strange here. And he's often, again, he's a fascinating figure. He was a nature socialist and things, and so many ways very progressive. But in this blind spot and the way not only nationalist models were replicated, but imperialist, right, models. And so putting queer theory in a productive conversation with the gay rights, an identitary rights movement, and then to ask us, because I also recognize, and people have talked about this, you know, even from a strategic position, can we get rid of identities, right? They're politically feasible, maybe even necessary. And so the yearning for belonging is real and should be recognized. And so how to grapple with this? Is queer a non-identity? Is it always just there as a critique of identity politics? And so can we, and again, saying this against the backdrop of the rise of ethno-nationalism, can human beings live without those identities? Or have we failed in a sense to create viable non-ethno-nationalist identities for people to feel that they belong to? And so, I mean, this is related to my work on Soviet culture and translation in Soviet culture, where, you know, there was an attempt to use translation as kind of paraphrase. Vincent Raphael talked about translation as a technique of empire. They tried to use it as a technique of internationalism at various points. And so I've always been fascinated by the tension in something larger, something transnational, international solidarities, and in our modern world, in our post-romantic world, the really persistent attraction to nation-based affiliations.
One of the, and this is, I think, partly linked to some of the points you're making there, but anthologies, but that you're deeply critical of, and kind of borrowing this term from Dipesh Chakrabarty, is kind of historicism. Or at one point you talk about the sort of the epistemology of the closet, the idea that there's a kind of a movement from invisibility to visibility, from illegibility to legibility, and just as this the whole kind of discussion in translation studies about making translators visible and so on, and you're quite critical of this notion of again, to kind of use an adjective you mentioned there a few minutes ago, this a kind of an evolution, a kind of a movement towards the light, this kind of historicizing developmental kind of Western narrative about how you come into being, and so are you arguing to some extent that what we should be looking at are thinking less about visibility and thinking more about opacity? And I don't mean opacity in terms of untranslatability, but rather opacity in the sense that you can't make everything visible, you can't make everything transparent. That is it something in that area, Brian? Yes,
and it's specifically this the very seductive narrative of emancipation, and especially in the United States, this kind of Kantian movement into full maturity, which then gets this Bildung that gets applied often in these anthologies to the nation. I mean, that's one of the important sites where the notion of personal Bildung is adopted and adapted to the nation as a whole. And so you look at the writings of, or the introductions to some of these anthologies, and they'll talk about this emergence of this independent culture. So one of the important anthologists in the United States at the end of the 19th century was Stedman, Clarence Edmund Stedman, and in his anthologies, he doesn't include translations, and he says right out, of course, this is an anthology of American writing, so of course we're only including English language texts. So right, again, this idea that the national language of the United States is English, even though officially we don't have a national language, and then puts Longfellow on the second tier of American writers, because as he says, too much inspiration beyond the borders of the nation state. And of course, he was one of our most prolific translators, translating, among other things, Dante's Inferno, but many, many things. And he often placed translations side by side in his collections with his original writing. So I've read some interesting analysis that says this was his attempt to kind of enact this conversation across nations, right, within the boundaries. So he's relegated to the second tier, and posthumous editions of his works never respect that placement of translations alongside either the translations are gotten rid of or they're relegated to an appendix at the back, right? So that made me think of how these anthologies really enact a very interesting worlding of culture, but not just as we often think about it in terms of territory, what's in and what's out, but developmentally, what becomes relegated to our past. And then, I was horrified by the fact that he confirms the self-sufficiency of US culture by citing the American victory in the Spanish-American War. So jumping from aesthetics to this political realm. And of course, that was also the moment where the United States will argue shift from this settler colonialism to more traditional overseas imperialism, when we ended up with all of these non-English speaking territorial holdings. So it was fascinating. The anthology as a cultural form fascinated me. And I also didn't think I thought people weren't doing justice to the non-chronological anthologies, which again were often presented as kind of unenlightened, because they would often not use chronology, and they were called treasuries. The works were often referred to as, but I thought as I looked at them through a different lens, I thought, oh, how interesting that they thought these works from all different periods of time, from all different cultures on the same plane. They transcend time and place to create a truly international republic of letters, if we will. And it's the chronology which suggests that some are less developed and some are more developed. And it's no coincidence then that that Carpenter ends his anthology with works by Whitman, which not only, give this kind of, in his reading, this celebration of homosexuality or homoeroticism, but also that are in the English language. So there were many translations before, and then the anthology ends triumphantly in English. So yes, I found them really fascinating and really powerful ways to think about not just, again, these things territorially, as we often do in translation studies, or carrying over and things, but temporally.
Yeah, and it's interesting, I think, as well. I mean, it's a point that you mentioned in passing one of the chapters, the way in which, and again, this is to do with this kind of romantic preoccupation with origins. If you can't find the original text, you make them up. This kind of the profusion of the creation of these kind of fake medieval texts in different languages in Europe in order to establish a kind of a pedigree for yourself. So there's a curious kind of flipping or back translation into kind of archaizing forms of the language in order to create that sense of a genealogy and points of origin that then go from that into the into the modern moment in various ways.
But I also think it's interesting in terms of just the way translations can trouble these notions of authenticity that were established in Romanticism. I just to think about the fact that Songs of Ossian was not only one of, if not the most popular, most widely read work of the 18th century, it was the most translated. And so authenticity is something we grapple with, and I think queer theory challenges that in a number of different ways.
Yeah, I think it's also, how you uncouple productivity from reproductivity. Because one of the things about the Ossian translations was how immensely kind of productive and fertile they were in terms of the various movements that it gave rise to and different kind of creative currents. So it was a remarkably kind of prolific, fertile form of literary creation, which again, as you say, kind of undermines that romantic ideology of the origin. One of the points that you touched on earlier was the way in which there was a need to reconsider or to reevaluate particular kinds of identity politics. So a particular kind of movement would get dominated largely by the usual suspects, white middle class males, and then critique around intersectionality and the need to consider so many different parameters. And is that where you see translation as having an absolutely crucial role to play in developing particular kinds of intersectional thinking? I'm thinking in particular here of something that you do stress at many different points in the book, which is the way in which the internationalization of a certain discourse around gay or lesbian rights can become deeply oppressive in different contexts if you're not bearing in mind the translational dynamics that occurs as we move from one space to another.
Yes, and I often thought that about post-Soviet Russia, and that Western writings about that the gay movement there was dead and that they somehow failed be activist. And what was fascinating to me is that again, that was the projection of a kind of narrative of emancipation, right? And so all of this Western investment in the fall of communism as a transition to Western democracy and capitalism, of course, and that it was this a great emancipation. And that's why I became fascinated with the memoirs of Charlotte von Mahlsdorf, the East German transvestite, because she didn't buy into that at all. And even though the memoir became packaged in that moment to reflect Western investments in Eastern Europe, she starts it with the attack by neo-Nazi skinheads on her museum in 1992. So it's after unification, it's after, and so very presciently, she saw that the rise of ethno-nationalism was the big threat. And yet they wanted to package this as an emancipation from the Nazis and then from East German communism. So I became fascinated by her kind of critique, but also then by the packaging of her, because she also said when the Berlin Wall fell, she was very blasé about it. And she said, oh yeah, a lot of my gay friends, they're going to go over there, look around, and then come back home. And but the failure kind of to read it in that way, because we were so invested in seeing it as an emancipation story. And, and again, these same emancipation stories that led that was used to justify the US invasion of Iraq and so on, or to emancipate, the Arab women, right? These emancipation stories. And again, they're powerful because they do have so much purchase, of course. Who doesn't want to be free? I look at very fascinating historical transnational histories like Greg Grandin's The Empire of Necessity, where he's looking at the late 18th, early 19th century and says, how could it be that the age of liberty was also the age of international slavery? So to be able to queer these still very seductive narratives is, I think, hugely, hugely important. And yes, translation's role in doing that.
Yeah. One of the things that, and this is kind of the subject of chapter 5 in your book, is the way in which the novel as a form gets fetishized, because it neatly expresses this notion of development, of historical evolution, reaching the kind of the emancipatory moment of maturity. And as a result of that, then the lyric as a site of queer performance, queer experience, and so on, gets gradually marginalized. And you look in particular at the translations of the Russian poet Alexei Apukhin. Do you think one of the functions of translation, particularly lyric translation, is to kind of resist that kind of hegemony of the novel, and also maybe to resist the kind of the novelization of the lyric, where the lyric gets turned into a kind of a diary entry, a page from the life story of Heaney or whoever.
Yes, yeah, that was one of the most interesting chapters, because it came out of my dissatisfaction with some of the work being done on queer lyrics. I mean, some really fascinating theorization, which was very much informed. But when I looked at, there was an article about queer anthologies in a book edited by Keith Harvey, very nice book on language desire. I forget the entire title. It wasn't about translation. It was before he was really working in translation. And it was about gay anthologies. And the premise was that you had gay anthologies and then you had general anthologies. And the work of W.H. Auden, for example, some of his greatest lyrics like Lay My Sleeping Head, My Love, weren't included in the gay anthology. And why not? And blah, blah, blah. And I thought his point was going to be, why not? Just because they don't have any specific markers of the lyric subject's homosexuality. But his argument turned out opposite, that gay poets needed to include more distinct markers. So this I found bizarre. And so again, it was all of this constant visibility as liberation. And of course, there were all these attempts to out poets like Whitman, like Lorca, and so on. And how do we resist a paranoid reading of their as simply closeted, right? And they need us to come in and open the closet door. And so instead, to see that they were dealing with something, or they had created this really queer erotic space that was, I felt in some ways, reduced and to, you know, some set of, as you say, like confession or discrete set of identity markers. And so then I actually did a kind of close reading of the analysis of an article about Jack Spicer's translations of Lorca, and I wasn't convinced at all that these were somehow, that Lorca was somehow closeted, or that Whitman poem was somehow closeted. I just, it didn't fit at all. So yes, I do see other people talking about, like Preciado talking about, we need a rebirth of poetry. It's this kind of lyric, anti-novelistic lyric sensibility and way of, maybe queer way of apprehending the world, as opposed to, so I don't know if it's the outing as a kind of, and again, that's the crudest way of putting it, but this kind of outing as a kind of form of paranoid reading that I was thinking about. And then how can we read lyric queerly through translation as what Sedgwick called a form of reparative reading.
I mean, and is there an analogy at some level, you know, with what's called restorative ecology? That, you know, it was one of the things that in translation is, you know, we've had centuries of, you know, highly extractivist practices. I mean, kind of instrumental practices, kind of missionary linguists, you know, going in there, working with the indigenous, grabbing, you know, what was seen as the necessary knowledge in order to locate where the resources were, how to better contain indigenous populations, and so on. And that kind of, that notion, that instrumentalist paradigm, which, you know, is so overwhelming in the localization industry and so on, that that really what you're describing are forms of instrumental practice.
Yeah, and in fact, especially in the post-World period, that immediate period, which is often referred to as kind of the birth of translation studies in the West, it was this, they doubled down on this extractivist notion of you remove the content from the form, and this is how we make advances in machine translation, this is how we ensure objectivity and so on. And so you see this abandonment of the previous framing of translation as art, and this was across Europe. Was l'art de traduire, Kunst, art, and then it's science, 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 or technology, etc., culminating, of course, in Nida's The Science of Translation, bizarrely about Bible translation. So yes, it really, they doubled down on this extractivist point of view at a time when you were getting new internationalist kind of world order dominated by the West and by the US. So yeah, I think it was, and of course, the way we wrote our histories of the field, typically that pre-war period was, I think James Holmes said something about there was desultory writings on, it's not so. There was quite an interesting body of things, but it was framed as art. And so that became literally passé, and now it had to be a science. And I thought that really institutionalized this extractivism in our field, in our theory.
One of the people that you mentioned, who is the subject of your last chapter, is Charlotte von Malstorff. And I was just thinking in terms of, so Charlotte is transvestite, and then the way in which, you know, trans issues have emerged in the kind of the dialogue with queer studies and so on. So the extent to which, you know, does it require a radical reorientation of queer studies, or is it rather a kind of a deepening of perspectives of already existing perspectives in queer studies. And Doug Robinson's book, I think it's from 2019, the transgender translation and translingual address. I mean, do you think that a lot of the debates that are present around trans issues, are they offering new perspectives for how we perceive or engage with translation study, or are they a kind of a furtherance of already existing debates within the ambit of queer studies? Queer theory?
Right. So I was lucky to attend several years ago a workshop studying transgender that was held at the University of Arizona, organized by David Gramling and Susan Stryker. And it brought together people working in all different fields. And that's when I actually started, each person came in with a project. And that's when I started working on the von Mausdorff, because I remember I bought the volumes, especially when I was in Russia, the Russian translation, and I had it in the back of my mind, this was intriguing, and I developed the project there. And it was such a rich exchange of perspectives. So I'm not sure whether, certainly there, queer studies and trans studies are in a very productive, very interesting relationship. But I also saw an opportunity there to, again, maybe query the dominance of English and English models in trans studies through the lens of translation. And so I paired my study of von Mausdorff's memoir, again, which sets off issues of translation in interesting ways, just because the title, Ich bin meine eigene Frau, has this German polysemous Frau, which can be woman or wife. And of course, in the initial euphoric transition period, it's translated as woman, because then you have, I am my own woman, by analogy with being your own person, right? So independence, again, the perfect culmination of this Bildung. But I paired it with the publication history of the French hermaphrodite Herculine Barbin, and again was fascinated at the non-linear progression of this narrative. I mean, it was always presented as, again, this emancipatory thing, especially in the 1980 English edition, which says the newly discovered manuscript. Well, it was first published in the 19th century by Tardieu. I mean, it was hardly newly discovered. And then Foucault was aware of this. So, again, it's this need to present it as new, and, we're taking it out of the archive into the light. But Foucault's 1978 French edition was quite interesting, because he did not want to give that an oppressive frame. And so he doesn't include an introduction, nothing. You open it and you hear Barbin's voice first. And then in the English 1980, they take a lecture that he given, they make that the opening essay. And so he becomes very much the framer of that. And then they also include a short story by an Austrian writer about von Mausdorff. In any case, when I went back and looked at the first edition by Tardieu, which of course is heavily framed, it's 2 volumes. The first volume is his treatise on what he calls a vice de conformation. And then the second volume is the memoir of von Mausdorff. But again, resisting the temptation of saying, yes, this is this because his works is very problematic in terms of reading homosexuality on the body and things like that. At the same time, he argued respecting Barbin's rhetoric, because she goes back and forth between, they go back and forth between masculine and feminine pronouns. And the US edition basically says, this is not important, and they don't try to recognize that. And Tardieu says, I think this is something about an important means of expression, and so I preserved this in my edited volume. And so again, just resisting the temptation. It was far more complicated. And then again, when you get in period, especially the post-Stonewall period, the imposition or the ascendancy of Anglo models, which were often monolingual and didn't pay attention to the translations and the translation histories. But that 1980 English edition then became the original for almost all the other translations of Barbin's memoirs in Europe and throughout the world. I think the Russians were the only ones who translated from the Foucault 1970.
Directly from that, yeah, absolutely. We've got a question here from Mara Mendes Galvan. And she said, I would love to hear them both speak about how the translation of older texts, quite old, particularly from ancient cultures up to, say, early medieval, can play an important role in not just shedding light upon those works, but also as criticism of the notion of evolution in literature, the idea that older literature was more primitive and then evolved. Even literary theorists sometimes tend to read those texts very philologically or historically, etc. And translation can potentially help uncover the ingenuity of language and thought present in those texts between quotes, because they weren't always written down, at least not immediately, of course. I think this very much chimes with, I know a number of the arguments that you make in your book, Brian. Would you like to say something?
Yes, no, that's a great question. Also, because the gay rights movement in the 19th century was so dependent on these ancient Greek texts, right, to document the persistence of homosexuality in all times and places, but especially in the great, most prestigious of all cultures, the ancient Greeks. And so they depended on translation. And in a sense, not just translation, because there are all different ways to translate, but they were deeply informed by the rise of scientific historicism in Germany at the end of the 18th, early 19th century, which posited as a goal to try to see other cultures, especially cultures from the past, kind of to the extent possible in their own terms. So this led to the first non-Boulderized translations into English of Plato that existed. There had been none before. Either his works were heterosexualized, so male pronouns switched to female, or those homosexual passages were simply elided. And so these were the first. And then the gay rights activists, many of whom, like Carpenter, knew other languages, like Simmons, they translated a lot, and they could use that argument put forward by the scientific historicists to shame people who continued to either leave out those segments or to obscure them somehow in their translations. So the mode of translation became very central to the emergence of this. But in terms of the previous cultures and the actual practice, I was really deeply influenced of one of the great seminal works in queer historiography, which is Carolyn Dinshaw's Getting Medieval, and especially that opening chapter where she talks about a key, I think, medieval term that's variously translated, and notes that, number one, we have not been able to establish a single translation of the term or a single meaning of the term, that it might be that it was the meaning was in flux, and so on. And so that also led me to develop this idea maybe of uneasy translation, again, to counter this idea of utilized rapid translation, and meaning not just that we take a long time with it and sit on, but that we sit with the notion that we might not know, and how we make that part of our work, and present the arguments for different interpretations, but understand that things might be unstable, again, when we're talking about words that are polysemous and so on. And it was also interesting because John Boswell's work on same-sex unions in the medieval world, or in the early Christian world, received a lot of flack from historians that he was over-reading the data and blah, blah, blah. And it turned out later that his lexicographers discovered mentions of that key term that he uses in ways that it could be used about something close to a personal relationship. Because the reigning dominant interpretation was it was a treaty, and his argument that it could also be used for personal bonds and same-sex bonds. Anyway, lexicographers discovered sources that allowed us to read this differently. So understanding that, again, a queer focus on language, that most words are polysemous, meanings are often unstable, that in the past it's very difficult to establish definitive meanings. And also, where I talk polysemia, and especially as used by queer writers like Gloria Anzaldúa to the discrete borders of the nation state and of national languages. Her use of cognates and so on, or non-translation and quasi-translation in her work is fascinating because they're pointing to those places where languages bleed into each other. There aren't discrete borders where this is, they're separated. So yeah, sorry, that might be a not satisfying answer, but it was very important to my thinking, Carolyn Dinshaw's work, and especially prioritizing early texts and how to translate them.
Yeah, no, Maria Mendes Galvan came back saying, I love the idea expressed in the meaning was in flux. Translation could even strive to display that instability, for sure. Loving this commentary. So I think this precisely this kind of the riskiness, the kind of plurality, the way in which it. I mean, I sometimes think, it's these two Latin words, fundus and fonts. That we often tend to think of cultures in these kind of fundus, foundational terms. You strip away everything, you get this kind of bedrock. Whereas, to some extent, it would be much more interesting if we thought of cultures not as fundus but as fonts, as the springs. These things that are just keep kind of bubbling up to the surface in all kinds of unpredictable and risky ways. There is a question here from Patricia. Can we please have the name of the author Dr. Baer was referring to, the one who argues Garcia Lorca was closeted? Both Lorca and Cernuda were pretty open about their homosexuality in the 20s and 30s. Thank you.
Right, it's I can never pronounce his name. Eric, I can find it, but his on Jack Spicer's translations of Lorca. And so initially that Spicer was kind of outing Lorca, or those moments where there's a great scene where I think it's Simmons actually meets Walt Whitman and tries to get Walt Whitman to admit he's homosexual. And Whitman's cryptic response is, I have 6 children, which we don't know if is true or not. They would be illegitimate children. But of course, saying this also to Simmons, who had 4 children, because he'd been married and had 4 children, right? So this completely queer response to the notion and maybe to the whole project of normalizing him into a discrete identity.
If I could ask you a question, Brian, which is not strictly speaking sort of related to our discussion of queer theory, although I think in a way it might be. You're somebody who's for all of your professional life has worked through Russian language literature and culture, and the fact of translation in Russian literature and language as kind of fascinated you. And just in the context of what's happening at the present in the Ukraine, and a lot of the debates then that have come up with respect to the language, the languages and cultures of Russia. I mean, do you see a role for someone like yourself as both as a translation scholar, as a queer theorist, as somebody who's deeply engaged with Russian literature and culture, a way of using translation to think about both what's happened and how one constructs a kind of a space that gets us out of the kind of the killing fields.
Yeah. Well, first I want to say that I was happy to participate in an online conference sponsored by the University of Banska Bystrica in Slovakia, which has now put up several of the translation study scholars in Ukraine that have had to flee the country. Thinking of people like Alexander Kalnichenko from the University of Kharkov, and also Lada Kolemiets from University of Kiev. And what's been fascinating about my work, especially, they've been an enormous help in providing me with materials from the archives from a period I'm especially fascinated in, the 1920s, which of course the histories of the field that are often written and that are dominant in the West have our field beginning basically after the Second World War. Whereas in the Soviet Union, it began basically not long after the revolution with the founding of World Literature Publishing House by Maxim Gorky and Alexander Anatoly Lunacharsky in 1918. And that led to the first booklet for training translators by Kanichukovsky and Gumilyov, and which Fedorov calls the first work of modern translation theory, which immediately debunks the whole notion of equivalence in translation. So it's very interesting. In any case, the Russians and Ukrainians were working very closely in this period. They were both very productive thinking about translation. They were reading each other's works, citing each other, etc. And one of these figures fascinates me is Alexander Fedorov, and he wrote one of the first monographs called The Theory of Translation in 1929, in which he expands our thinking about translation for the first time kind of in a scholarly way beyond literary translation or Bible translation, to include what he calls non-literary texts, which then underneath that category, he has three subcategories, which he takes from or adapts from the work of the Swiss linguist Charles Bailly, which I think it's administrative, journalistic, and political. So my experience with all that really forced me to confront what De Souza Santos talks about as the academic monocultures of the West, and how Soviet translation studies had been completely written out of the histories of modern translation studies, and underscoring how much investment we continue to have in that post-World War II period as one of, again, liberation from fascism, right? So this is the ultimate liberation story, and that we still feed on it, and that the histories of the field tried to capitalize on that in the way, and how challenging it would be to see that that wasn't the only possible origin for our field. Communism could have been another origin, because of course that was also a movement deeply concerned with internationalism and transnationalism. So there was that exclusion, and then to see how contemporary Russian relation studies has the really important contributions of those Ukrainian scholars in that early period. So I also would say, as a note of hope, because those monocultures continue to do their very exclusionary, destructive work, but translations can begin to change, or I think to redress that geopolitical imbalance of knowledge. And so I was pleased to see in the recent Handbook of Translation Studies, edited by Christian Malmkjær out of Cambridge, that the essay on translation theory by Jeremy Monday contained a couple references to Andrei Fedorov's work, which I recently translated. So it's a work from 1953, but it didn't appear in our essays on translation theory until now, because there was a translation. I'm working with Alexander Kalnichenko from University of Kharkiv to produce a translation of Finkel's 1929 work as well. So I do think it's important. I think it's important, but again, this is tied up with big issues related to how the geopolitics of knowledge is institutionalized and replicated. I think Western scholars should be compelled to invest some of their intellectual labor in translations. And it's hard, though, when universities don't recognize translation as scholarship. So, it's this vicious circle. But I do think that high quality annotated translations can begin to change the conversation, can, as I argued in an article in the in the Translator a couple of years ago in their anniversary issue on the myth history of translation studies, that, you know, we can start to create a more rhizomatic history of the field, that there were we can begin to compare those historical cultural moments in which sustained and deep thinking about translation occur, and then try to see why it is and how those moments, how those historical contexts shape the thinking that happens, and so on.
Precisely. On that note, Brian, I think you've given us in the last hour a beautiful example of how that rhizomatic thinking might happen. But so on behalf of the Trinity Centre for Literary and Cultural Translation and everybody who joined us for this conversation, I would like to say a very, very big thank you. And I can say, both as series editor and as a fan of your work, I look forward to further work in the future, and particularly I think work that you so correctly identify as important in complexifying our perspectives and removing us from the kind of the tyranny of binaries and the enslavement of particular kinds of monocultures, which affect translation studies as much as any other practice of human thought. So thanks again, Brian, for joining us today. So I would like to thank everybody for joining us for this lunchtime conversation. If you're interested in other events that we organize, you can go to our website, tcd.ie/literary-translation. If you are particularly interested in and would like to further support the work of our centre, you can become a friend of the TCLCT, and you'll find information on that on our website. So /literary-translation/friends. So thank you once again for joining us today.